Hello, strangers. If you've been here before, welcome back. And if you're new here, welcome. I've got another true scary story for you. One that's never been posted anywhere else. And this one is story number 32.
Once upon a time, a 1 Alpha 2X1 aircraft loadmaster, known as a loadie, happened to wander into our armory. It was a bog standard day, but we all happened to be in a good mood, and so we cut her in on the jokes. I guess she took a shine to us, and she became sort of our token aircrew. She even got the invite on weekend bar hops and pub crawls. That's the awesome thing about the military. You know how back in primary school you just happened to be best friends with people you sat next to in arts and crafts or whatever? The military is just an extended director's cut of that. Not that every person you meet is your best friend for life. There's always the strange ones, just like the kid who ate dried glue in 4th grade or whatever. But Henderson wasn't a glue eater. She fit in well with our group. Now, I'm sure folks outside the military are aware of its heavy flavor of traditions, but what you may not know is its equally rich lore of superstition. And from talking to Henderson, aircrew may be the most superstitious of all. There's things like never flying without a particular item, like how baseball players have a special bat or a pair of socks. Only for aircrew, it's a particular visibelt or beanie. Other superstitions are more like jinxes. If your sortie or flight is delayed due to weather or maintenance, you mustn't touch the food you brought with you. If you get bored and dip into your food supply, limited for the day to whatever food you chose to bring with you, there are no vending machines or gas stations in the sky. Not only will your flight eventually take off, but you'll be extended, your stomach grumbling for hours as you fly far beyond how much food you'd even planned originally. Like actors backstage at a play avoiding the word Macbeth, saying the words bag drag will fetch dirty looks. Bag drag is a term meaning your jet is down hard, and the entire crew and all the equipment must disembark and drag everything over to a spare jet to set everything back up all over again, dragging a long day out longer. No one is happy about a bag drag. So, yeah, aircrew are a superstitious bunch. It was one of those nights when we were at the final bar of the evening. While people had peeled off in 1s and 2s to go home and rack out, there were still 7 of us left. Henderson was one of them. We were talking about close calls, times when, if something had gone slightly differently, we wouldn't have made it home. It probably sounds morbid, but to be honest, we were laughing and cracking jokes, whistling past the graveyard kind of stuff. Henderson was laughing right along with us, and then shared something of her own past. And while at that night we laughed about it too, it's one of those stories that I just can't forget, so I'm sharing it here, with some details fudged for OPSEC, and because I was drunk. This is the way Henderson told it. Tail 139 was supposed to be lucky when it arrived on base. It was our squadron's number, after all. But this jet had a history. Before it was gutted, reassigned to the Guard, 139 was an HR mission jet. And in the military, HR does not mean human resources. It means human remains. After the little fanfare at the commander's call, the grizzled maintainers gathered around their usual post, the smoke pit, and muttered the arcane knowledge that maintainers always have. Their pronouncement? Jets cursed. given that the maintainers had actually been on the aircraft, checking it for flight readiness. Henderson was intrigued and wanted more info. Obviously, the plane's engines, landing gear, etc. had all had a thorough check, but the inside bay was pretty bare to make room for its previous cargo. The maintenance and crew chief didn't spin tales of anything gory. They spoke instead of a heaviness. Wandering around the plane during their inspections, they kept remarking to each other that, despite the multiple people moving around, the air felt still, stale, like a sealed-off room left vacant for years. Their parting advice to Henderson was to double-check her oxygen gear. It had bad air. Per Henderson, she was on the inaugural flight of Tail 139, and as she explains it, while I was very conscious of every creak and thunk, nothing really happened. A friend of mine who flew it later on in the week had a similar take, but he did mention that, despite performing his pre-flight actions to the checklist, same as he always did, he discovered post-flight that a coupling on his emergency oxygen mask had failed sometime during the flight. When he went to disconnect it, he found it dangling. It was reported and fixed, but given the jet's past and aircrew's love of superstition, rumors started quickly. I didn't pay them a ton of credence. Bored airmen love to embroider the small facts into elaborate fiction, but I'd be lying if I said I ever forgot that I was on 139 when I had to fly it. It was a couple of months later on when my crew had to bag drag to a spare. As we walked along the tarmac, the bulky shape of said spare, Tail 139, blotted out the sun struggling to rise over the horizon. The crew chief walked alongside me. His mouth looked strangely naked without its customary cigarette. There's no smoking allowed on the flight line. Quietly, he asked me if I knew what the problem was with our jet. I looked at him, then back over my shoulder at the jet we'd abandoned for the day. I told him I believed I'd heard it was one of the navigationals. But he stopped me and corrected me, saying, No, he wanted to know if I knew what was wrong with our spare, with 139. I looked at it. It was hunched on the tarmac like an animal curled up to sleep, or to wait. I asked him what, and the crew chief looked at me and said, Nothing. There's nothing wrong at all. It's a jet that knows its purpose. It just wants to do it. I laughed. I mean, the eerie stillness of the morning, the foreboding of our first jet losing its sense of direction, the persisting strangeness of Tail 139 that everybody seemed to feel. All of it put me on edge. And now, the grizzled maintainer leaning close and telling me the big scary secret was nothing at all. It was just absurd, and it hit my funny bone that way. All I could get out was, well, lucky plane. We're taking it up today, and it'll get to fly again. He shot me a sideways glance, but he left it at that. We climbed up the landing stairs onto 139 and got busy running pre-flight checks. I looked about the empty belly of the jet, for a moment seeing the orderly rows of the fallen who had been its load before it came to us. I got that same deathly still feeling the others had mentioned before. But then the engine started, and 139 shuddered to life, shaking loose the weird stillness. What followed was the call to pressurize the plane. That staticky pressure suddenly crowded my ears, causing them to pop. But the pressure in my head didn't release. It built up. More pressure than usual, I thought. Or was I just nervous, performing Valsalva maneuvers too early from fear? I popped my ears again, and the pressure finally subsided, but I didn't feel relieved. Either something had been wrong, either momentarily with the air compressors, or I was being an absolute baby and jumping at shadows that weren't there. Neither made me feel like G.I. Jane. We strapped in, took off, climbed to our altitude, and nothing bad or weird happened. I ran all of our checks. We hit the track we were meant to fly, flew the sortie, and nothing bad or weird happened. Well, at least it seemed that way. I do remember a couple of times when I'd turn and get like a camera flash going off, and for a split second, the world would go gray, almost like the camera flash showed some ghostly image of the past. Did I tell anyone? I absolutely did not. Admitting I was being such a total fraidy cat to the rest of the crew was not an option. I could hear the relief cracking through the voices on our internal communication system. None of my other crew members seemed at all freaked out. No way was I, the only girl aboard, going to act like I was scared. As the other flight crew discussed their checks, shot the breeze, I forced myself to ignore it, and the nervy high-wire tension seemed to peel away like paraffin as I relaxed and saw that nothing bad was happening. The worst thing to happen was a small, persistent headache that began to build, seemingly roosting behind my eyes. It was annoying, sure, but this too was completely normal. People of the female anatomical persuasion tended to dehydrate a bit on flights, as the setup for relieving yourself on the jet wasn't built with the ladies in mind, so to speak. So we drank less water and generally had little lingering headaches from it. Like I said before, nothing was out of place. It was all in my head, I kept telling myself. But then came the practice landings. This is normal for most aircraft training missions. The back-enders get their training, so must the front end. It can get a bit boring for the aircrew not actually flying the jet. But wouldn't you rather have your pilot with reflexes to land the plane safely, no matter what's going on? I know I would. Still, that final call of one to a full stop generally brings cheers as it signals the end of the sortie, and that soon we'll be landed and heading home. I looked around at the other 4 or 5 back-enders, sharing a smile and some relieved eye rolls as the pilot announced this last and final call. We'd been wearing our headphones the entire flight, large blocky ones that, even with the comfort gel ear cups most people bought, still pinched your head a bit. I still had my little headache, and to give myself a moment of relief, I removed the headset and rubbed at the sides of my head where the pain sat. But that's when I heard something else. Over my pounding eardrums, I heard a hiss, quiet but growing louder. I looked up to where the sound appeared to be coming from. When I saw the white mist, my whole body reacted before my brain could even form the name for what this was. Insidious leak. The plane was pressurized, but somehow an opening, a split seam, had gapped during the flight, and the air exchange from this opening was presenting like white mist, signaling the pressure meant to ensure the crew had enough oxygen to breathe at higher altitude was failing. Meaning, I looked around the cabin and really focused. I noticed that my vision seemed sort of blurry, gray again, more than those flashes of gray I'd had before. But when I really squinted, I could see that the other guys I'd just shared smiles and mouthed "thank God" at all had the telltale blue tint to their lips. Chances were, my lips were blue too. And that blue tint, my fuzzy vision, meant we were all losing oxygen, and soon would lose the motor functions and consciousness of oxygen too. Like the pilots practicing landings to build life-saving reflexes, all aircrew are drilled on oxygen and pressurization failure procedures, and that hiss, now louder and louder, was like a starting pistol to my own reflexes. I grabbed my emergency oxygen, a little green purse we all carried, called an EPOS. I pulled it over my face and felt stale air slam into my lungs as the plastic hood crinkled against my head. You know that scene from Wizard of Oz? The one where suddenly the gray gives way to vibrant technicolor? It was just like that. Suddenly, I could see my crew members in 4K Ultra HD with supersaturated color. Further, I saw their glazed eyes, their stained blue lips, all the signs we were trained to notice in the air. I didn't have time to panic. I turned to my right to tell the crew member seated next to me, a guy named McCarthy, what was going on. His eyes might as well have had a buffering sign across them. He was out of it. So I helped him pull his EPOS on. When I turned back to the others, I found that they had noticed the activity of what I and McCarthy were doing, what we were wearing, and their own reflexes had kicked in. All of us were donning or helping others don oxygen. I knew we had minimal time to act. EPOSs do not have an eternal supply, and while the flight deck would be less affected than the back end where the leak was, sooner or later, it would hit our pilots, the guys driving the plane. I dragged McCarthy, who was still slow but coming around, with me, as I got up and moved to the flight deck. The door was closed, standard ops, and when I opened it, I didn't need to tap on anyone's shoulder to get attention. Both pilots turned. They saw me, saw the EPOS, then their eyes darted back to McCarthy behind me, and the scene behind us. I turned, and saw the white mist was thicker. It was clinging to the top of the fuselage like mossy clouds. I turned back and saw the pilots flipping their own oxygen masks over their faces, keying mics and calling maydays, alerting the ATC to our emergency landing procedures. McCarthy and I took 2 spare seats in the flight deck, McCarthy in the spare behind the pilot, me in the jump seat between pilot and co-pilot. The pilots began reading each check out loud over the intercom and the outgoing radios. As we'd already been landing, we were lined up with the runway, just about the most perfect situation to be in for an emergency. ATC had no problem clearing us, notifying emergency personnel to the flight line to respond. We landed hard, and maybe that jostle was what finally popped the split seam in the back of the jet. All at once, our insidious leak, a little hiss at a small opening, erupted into a rapid decompression, what happens when a pressurized container suddenly loses all that pressure at once. We call it rapid D. It's heralded by a loud bang and a sudden drop in temperature. I had heard about the banging sound in training, we all had, but knowing it occurs because a dry PowerPoint deck says it does, as opposed to hearing it, a roll of thunder so loud your eyes water and your ears ring, is something else. We didn't have the time to wait for the emergency responders to roll the stand over to the main door. Instead, the pilots kicked open the crew entry chute in the flight deck floor. We scrambled down that ladder like we were being chased. Despite the EPOS still crinkling against my face, and my lungs feeling like they'd been socked with a sack full of mud and rocks, I found myself running away from the jet, a blur of reflexes both trained and instinctive. To be honest, it all happened so fast that my body was on the ground, clustered with my crew yards away from the jet, before my thinking mind could realize we'd all gotten out, back end and pilots alike. The pilot was doing muster, making sure we'd all gotten off the jet. At least, I think he was. But my ears ached, and even when he got in my face, yelling so loud I could feel his breath on my skin, I couldn't hear him. Where'd my EPOS go? I dumbly repeated in my head over and over. I didn't realize until later that I held the thing in my hands. I have no idea when or where I'd removed it. Me and 3 of the back-enders ended up having to go to Flight Med to get checked out. McCarthy had it the worst. Between being the farthest back in the cabin and thus closest to the leak, he'd had the worst of the hypoxia. Another crewmate who'd been closest to the explosion had bleeding from his ears and nose. One of his eardrums was so concussed they thought he might need flight career-ending surgery. Thank God he didn't, but it was a sobering reminder of how important emergency procedures can be. As for Tale 139, the crew chief and maintainers could never pinpoint a cause for how the leak or explosion could have happened. Believe me, they were grilled hard on it, but they had all the stress tests and pre-flight check paperwork to show not a single step had been skipped. The jet was taken to the hangars for a full inspection and rebuild. Tail 139 disappeared from the flight schedule, but not the rumor mill. I guess they must have gotten it fixed to a point where it could be flown to another base, maybe for further repair or for reassignment. Whichever it was, it disappeared without a word from our hangars, not seen again since I've been here. Part of me hopes its final sortie took it to the boneyard for permanent retirement. But another small part of me just knows it wasn't retired, and it's out there, somewhere, still operational. If I'm right, I just hope its new role is its original role. HR missions. For now, I know what the crew chief meant to say when he held back his thoughts on the tarmac that morning during our bag drag. He had said Tail 139 knew its purpose and wanted to get back to it. 139 had carried the dead, and it wanted to return to that purpose by any means necessary.
And that is story number 32. The stories are numbered arbitrarily, simply either in order of how they were remembered or how quickly my friends responded when I'd send them a 2 a.m. text asking, "Hey, didn't we used to know a girl that did some sort of fetishy balloon stuff?" Don't worry, that one's coming, but it'll be PG-13 as I try to keep it here. If you liked the video, please be sure to give it a like. Commenting always appreciated, and subscription if you have the time. But I am just so delighted you were here today. Stay strange, stay safe, and please stay seated and belted in until the jet comes to a complete stop. Until next time, take care, strangers.